I know that many folks are joining, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started for the interest of time and to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. My name is Jessie Marr. I'm the Director of Technology at the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, and thrilled to be joined by our collaborators at the Center for Neighborhood Technology and We Act for Environmental Justice to walk through some work that we've been doing to characterize disadvantaged communities in the current edition of the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, as well as share some recommendations on where adjustments to this tool might be helpful in advancing Justice 40. Logistics-wise, please ask questions throughout the webinar. As I said, this is a meeting format so that we have the ability to see one another, interact, chat, and our goal is to spend at least half of the time on discussion. We will likely not have time for everyone's input as the numbers keep growing in this meeting, but and we know that some folks might not prefer to engage over Zoom, but any questions or comments, please feel free to send them via email as well afterwards, and look forward to continuing the discussion throughout the webinar and afterwards. And so today, we are going to give a brief background on Justice 40 and the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. We're going to highlight some limitations and challenges of the current version, and then walk through 4 recommendations on where we think improvements could be helpful. This work was a really collaborative effort between our organizations and was led by Manuel Senegal of We Act, Bob Bean of the Center for Neighborhood Technology, and Gabriel Watson of EPIC, but also worth noting this was informed by some of our colleagues at Anthropocene Alliance and Elevate. I'll let each of the speakers introduce themselves as they speak, and we'll try to keep this engaging with a lot of graphics and maps, but there's a lot of text peppered in throughout. Without further ado, I will pass it over to my colleague, Gabe.
Hey, thanks, Jesse. Gabe Watson here, Manager of Data Science and Applications at EPIC. And just to start off, I want to give a little space to talk about environmental justice, and in particular, the relationship with race and environmental justice. So environmental justice hazards such as air pollution, proximity to Superfund sites, rail yards, illicit and legal wastewater discharge, urban heat island, and other hazards are correlated with lower income people of color, and particularly higher population areas, and more importantly, for Black populations. Conversely, environmental benefits like parks, green spaces, tree coverage, and basic utility access like high quality, affordable water are inversely correlated. We also see that burdens are often stacked. So a community that faces one burden or a few burdens is more likely to face additional burdens. And furthermore, resilience to these burdens is also inversely correlated. So lower access to healthcare and abatement technologies like in-home air filters and water filters. So I have a quick example of this. This is the chart above is looking at proximity to Superfund sites in New Jersey. On the y-axis, % people of color. On the x-axis, total population within 3 miles. So what we see here is for each dot, which is a Superfund site, as you get a larger population, you see more people of color living in proximity, and those dots on the right side of the graph, if you look at the data spatially, are also really clustered together, right? So one community will have a Superfund site as well as the one next door. So this is really important when we talk about CEJST and climate, economic, and environmental justice screening tools. Now, it's really important to note, though, that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which says no person in the United States shall, on the grounds of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation and be denied the benefits or subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So there are really good things about Title VI, right? Thinking about race-based policies, housing discrimination, equal access, but there are also unintended consequences, right? And on the left, we have a quote from a paper produced by the NIH, right? Federally funded research that is clearly showing the relationship between environmental racism having a disproportionate effect on minority communities. Now, while Title VI of the Civil Rights Act suggests that race cannot be included in a tool like CEJST, race is an elemental component of environmental or climate economic justice. And we should be working to explicitly include race categories despite the potential or perceived judicial opposition. You want to next slide, Jesse? So let's take a step back and also talk about equity tools and policies, because I think this is a really important component when we're talking about CEJST. This effort of basically tying a policy that's geared towards prioritizing disadvantaged communities for environmental justice benefits really started in California with the cap and trade system. So there's basically a policy that says that a quarter of the proceeds of cap and trade have to go to disadvantaged communities. Now, we often spend a lot of time kind of going back and forth about the policies as it relates to administering benefits, but we don't often scrutinize the tools and methodologies that are kind of baked into these policies. So Cal EPA was charged with defining disadvantaged communities, and they created Cal EnviroScreen, which is a tool that like CEJST pulls together a variety of different indicators, but it's really important that we understand this relationship between the policy and the tool. Now, CEJST is really important in this whole ecosystem. One is that it's tied to the policy Justice 40, which is, we'll talk a little bit more about the details there, but essentially 40% of federal expenditure is to go to disadvantaged communities. And crucially, this is also from the White House, right? So it's not from a state or a federal agency, but directly from the executive office. I'll leave it to Jesse to talk a bit more about Justice 40.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. So as Gabe was saying, Justice 40 was came out of the executive order, the Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, with the goal of 40% of overall benefits of federal investments flowing towards disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, or overburdened by pollution. And to understand what communities the benefit should flow to as part of this initiative, the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or CEJST, as you'll hear us referring to, was created. And so a brief timeline of the history of that. So the executive order was introduced in February of 2021. The first version of, or the beta version of CEJST was introduced in February of 2022. And November of last year is when version 1 of CEJST was released. And that is what we're going to be talking about here today. And so I'll quickly walk through how this works for folks that may or may not be familiar with it. And this is kind of the basis of what our recommendations are coming from. And what's important for this conversation is that to be considered disadvantaged, you have to exceed the threshold for one category of burden and be low income. Tribes and those census tracts that are completely surrounded by disadvantaged communities and low income are also qualifying a disadvantage. So today we're going to be talking about how communities are qualified, the metrics that were used, and the guidance of how to make use of this tool. And so a little bit about what it looks like. You can visit screeningtool.geoplatform.gov, but it's a standard mapping application, looks relatively simple. You can go to your area of interest, you can type in your address or your city or state, or you can zoom into a particular place on the map. Once you zoom into the place on the map, you see the areas highlighted in blue are qualified as disadvantaged. On the right-hand side, you can see some information about that census tract, and then very clearly if it's considered disadvantaged or not, and then why. And these blue categories on the right-hand side, when you expand upon them, you can start to see what are the thresholds within each of those categories that this census tract met and the characteristics therein. So this is kind of the mechanics of CEJST. We could spend easily an hour walking through this in much greater depth. But today, just going to talk about some recommendations coming out of this tool. And framing this conversation is just to say this is probably the fastest that a federal agency has ever released a tool, and they followed a model of release, revise, and repeat. And just want to give a huge shout out to the team at CEQ, the U.S. Digital Service, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council that got us this far. And as many on the call know today, equitable data-driven decision-making is not easy. It would be a miracle if we got it right the first time. Probably not going to get it right the second time. We've been thinking about this for about a decade now, but the ability to hear where improvements can be made and where additional guidance may be helpful can get us one step closer in realizing our vision for Justice 40. And so with that, we're going to dive into these 4 recommendations, and I will pass it off to my colleague, Manuel.
Thank you, Jesse. My name is Manuel Salgado. I am an environmental justice research analyst with WEACT. WEACT is a community organization that strives for environmental justice. We are based out of Harlem, but I work in our federal policy office in Washington, D.C. Much of the analysis that I've been doing over the past few months has been centered on CEJST and trying to dive into and figure out, just how it's affecting communities of color. One of the big takeaways that we've taken from our analysis of the current iteration of the tool is that it's really not giving us a good representation of the nuance and the true environmental and economic burden that are shouldered by communities of color. I'm going to go ahead and walk you through some maps and some graphs in the next few slides that give you a more honest perspective of that environmental and economic burden that communities of color are shouldering currently. Okay, so the graph that we have here shows the percentage of population in communities of African Americans and the percentage of white persons living in communities that meet a threshold for a single CEJST data set. And as we add data sets, we can see the relationship that the percentage of African Americans within a community rises and the percentage of white persons decreases. In fact, if you look at communities that meet 6 data sets or more, they're majority Black, composed of an average of 52.51%. And on the flip side, communities that are less burdened and only meet 5 or fewer thresholds are about 17% Black and majority white. This is a pretty big issue. Justice 40 is designed as an environmental justice program meant to, be a correction of historical underinvestment in communities. And if we're not meeting that, that's a problem. Next slide. The current iteration, when it was added, it added about 15 million people that were newly considered disadvantaged from the beta version. Unfortunately, the population demographics of those 15 million was substantially different from the population demographics of the first cohort. These were about 2/3 white and only about 1/3 people of color, which is a flip of what we had seen prior. The end result was that we saw an increase in the percentage that white persons held in the entire tool and a decrease in the percentage of people of color, within the current iteration of the tool. Once again, we're approaching a total population within the tool that is approaching 40% of the nation's population. And so in the current iteration, without prioritization, we're seeing a dilution of the benefits that communities of color will see under Justice 40 if agencies are using the current iteration of the tool to guide their funding choices. Next slide. Now, I don't want to make it seem like this is not a good tool. CEQ was heavily challenged to design a tool without including race as one of the factors in designated disadvantaged communities. That's something that we would like to see corrected, and we would like to see race included. It's really the primary indicator of whether or not you're facing a high level of economic or environmental burden. But all that being said, CEJST is capturing communities of color within their tool. The map on the right here on the slide is of Northern Manhattan and the Bronx. And the areas that are shaded purple are areas that are primarily persons of color. These circles designate census tracts that are identified as disadvantaged within CEJST. And the bigger and the darker those circles get, the more of the CEJST categories they meet. So what we see here is a clear pattern that areas where people of color are living in the Bronx and in Harlem and Washington Heights are areas that are considered disadvantaged within CEJST. But it's not simply a matter of just being considered disadvantaged. We see here that when we take a look at the categories, the number of categories that they're qualifying under, they're carrying a large, environmental burden here. So while CEQ has designed a tool that identifies these communities very well, we're not seeing the total picture until we actually get a measure of cumulative impact here. Next slide. This is true across the nation. This is not simply a New York issue, but basically anywhere throughout the nation where there are communities of color. The Houston map on the left shows the areas very clearly where we have high levels of oil and gas industry. There's been historic pollution. There has been redlining. Those areas are identified as disadvantaged. Those areas are, once again, where communities of color are located, and they're carrying an enormous economic burden, but they're not all carrying equal amounts of burden. The areas to the east of downtown Houston have high levels of burden, some of them meeting all 8 categories. Whereas as you go further northeast, we do have disadvantaged communities that are facing hurdles, but they're not the same magnitude. In Detroit, Michigan, we see the same pattern. In the areas where we have communities of color, the areas are classified as disadvantaged. However, as we start moving out of Detroit into the suburbs to the north, CEJST does not identify those areas as disadvantaged, and those are areas that are primarily white. So our recommendation from here is that CEQ implement a method of accounting for this increased burden that communities of color are facing. Other federal tools do use an index method as opposed to a binary classification, and those account for cumulative impacts, and we'd like to see CEQ implement a methodology like that in the future and in the next iteration. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Bob Dean from CNT.
Okay, thank you, Manny. And it's been great working with you and EPIC on this analysis. So I'm Bob Dean. I'm the Chief Strategy and Program Officer with the Center for Neighborhood Technology, or CNT. We're a nonprofit based in Chicago that focuses on analytics and service to community organizations. So I'd like to just take a second here and give thanks to a couple of funders who helped us to do this work, the Kresge Foundation, Energy Foundation, and Natural Resources Defense Council. And also, even though I'm the one here speaking today, I want to give credit to CNT's analytics team who actually did all the math here, especially Paul Essling and John Kuda for their analytics and tool development help. So the point that I'm going to make here has to do with the economic threshold that's part of the CEJST tool. Because really from our analysis, the single most important indicator in the whole tool is the socioeconomic threshold. So as had been said previously, you have to hit the 65th percentile nationally for the share of the tract, for the proportion of people on the tract who are below 200% of the poverty line. And as Gabe said in the intro, to qualify, you have to hit at least one climate and environmental indicator, and you also have to hit that single economic indicator. And that indicator ends up being so important because most of the country meets at least one of the climate and environmental indicators. 80% of tracts in the country, to be specific, qualify under at least one of those economic or climate indicators. So having to meet the economic threshold is really what makes the biggest difference in terms of whether a tract qualifies or not. And that's simply too much weight to put on a single indicator. It really makes it almost just as important as all of the other 34 indicators combined. Can you go to the next slide, please, Jesse? It's also not necessarily a self-evident pick as the right socioeconomic indicator. We tested what it would look like instead if you qualified tracts that had median incomes at or below 80% of area median income. So AMI is an acronym I'll be using a bit here that stands for area median income, which is just the median income for a metropolitan area. So that varies quite a bit between high cost and low cost regions. But it's a very common measure used for affordable housing, among other federal programs. Specifically, the threshold of 80% of AMI is frequently used to define people or places who are low income. So it's an accepted alternative way of defining low income areas. And so we compared what if instead of using the 200% of poverty line as the indicator of income, you instead used 80% of AMI. And it turns out it's similar, but it's different. The blue circle here represents the current method, and the green represents the AMI alternative. So either way, about 27,000 tracts would qualify, but which 27,000 depends on which measure you choose. There's a lot of overlap, but switching the measure would gain about 5,000 tracts on one hand and lose about 500 or 5,000 on the other. So about 10,000 tracts would change their status simply based on this choice of income metric. And those 10,000 tracts are home to about 40 million people. So this is not a small share of the nation's population overall. You can go to the next slide, please. So CNT has created a mapping tool that lets you see this and play with this more. I'll put a link in the chat here. And otherwise, you can use this to detect the disadvantaged areas for yourself. So this is what it looks like. It's just a screenshot, and I'm going to show a couple screenshots here because I'm not brave enough to try to run a web tool demo in real time, particularly because a bunch of people on this call are about to jump on it and slow it down. So this is just going to be some static screenshots. But this highlights areas in orange that currently are disadvantaged under the definition in CEJST, and then some characteristics of areas that are not disadvantaged. So of those that don't currently qualify, the ones that are shown in blue don't qualify but are majority people of color. There are some that are in maroon that don't qualify but have high cumulative impacts, meaning they hit at least 5 or more categories of indicators. And there are some in purple, which are both. And so these have characteristics that you would usually associate with areas that have significant environmental justice concerns. They qualify in at least 5 categories of indicators, and they are majority people of color, but they are not included in the CEJST tool. So can you go to the next slide? The one that we are highlighting here, and could you go to the one in red there, Jesse, just put your mouse over it. Right there, yep. Is in Chicago, where CNT is based, in a neighborhood called McKinley Park. And the tract here is a very high priority for a local EJ group, Neighbors for Environmental Justice, because it's right across the street from an asphalt plant that creates severe impacts on air quality for nearby residents. And this tract qualifies under 5 categories of indicators and 8 individual indicators, but it is not considered a disadvantaged area because it misses the income measure. It does not reach the necessary percentile based on 200% of poverty. But based on other ways of measuring income, it is a lower income area. The median income here is 64% of the Chicago region's AMI. As I said before, the way it's often defined as low income is anything under 80%. And so 64% is very close to what you'd even consider a very low income tract by the definitions. So it's not considered lower income by the current definition, so it's not included as a priority area. But if you switch to AMI, it certainly would be. Can you go to the next slide? And you can use our tool to do other comparisons like this. This is just a screenshot of when you first open it. If you click a little button in the top right that says show filters, you get a lot of options. And you can do a lot with this. You can ask it, for example, who would qualify based on air quality problems versus flood risk, et cetera. But for this conversation, I'm really just going to talk about the income one. But please, you can play with it and certainly learn a lot more. And it gets interesting. Can you jump to the next slide? When you compare what would be gained or lost by switching the income measures. So using an AMI measure in addition to or instead of the poverty measure that's currently in there. So I just did 2 sample maps here for Chicago. You can all do your own for whatever geography you work in. But the map on the left shows anything that's shown here in blue or purple are places that would be added if you included AMI as a measure of demonstrating low income instead of just the poverty measure. The ones on the right are areas that are currently considered disadvantaged under poverty that would be lost or taken out of the tool if you took away the poverty measure and just switched to an AMI measure instead. So in Chicago, we gain a few more than we lose. And one thing you'll notice is that in bigger cities and higher cost cities, using AMI adds areas, but in rural and lower cost places, the measure based on poverty picks up more locations because AMI in those places is typically quite low. So we think that using a poverty measure across the country, we believe the way this is working in a CEJST tool now is using a consistent poverty measure for the country, at least the contiguous 48 states, while AMI varies tremendously by region to region because it includes cost of living. So if you live in a higher cost area like a city, AMI is a more favorable measure to use because it accounts for cost of living. So using poverty, the current measure kind of weights the CEJST tool toward rural areas and away from urban areas. CNT focuses our work in urban areas, so this observation concerns us. But we also recognize that environmental justice is a significant concern in rural areas too, including the rural South. And what this map shows that's on the screen now is if you replace the poverty measure and just got rid of that entirely and said we're going to use AMI instead, the areas shown in orange here would no longer be disadvantaged. And all of these would instead be replaced by tracts in and near major cities, but those tracts are too small to actually show up on this map. So I just want to emphasize, we're not recommending just switching out the poverty measure and using AMI instead. Instead, we're trying to show that making A pretty small and pretty plausible change in a single indicator would have a significant impact on who receives priority. And again, you have about 40 million people live in places that would change status based on that change. So our recommendation is really to de-emphasize the importance of this single indicator and instead have a more complex and balanced way of measuring income, and also weighing it appropriately against all of the other important indicators included in this tool. And now I'll turn this to, yes.
I was going to say one question from the chat while you have the mic is just how AMI is calculated outside of metropolitan areas.
Yes, I think that's a good question. I think my data expert, Paul Esling, may be on the call here. So Paul, if you could unmute and explain how we did that, or how we estimated it when CEJST did not include it, I'd appreciate it if you're okay being put on the spot.
Sure, no problem. Hi, I'm Paul Esling. So we use AMI in our H+T affordability index, the housing affordability, one of our tools. So so how we do it is we use a median income for a CBSA for tracts that are in a CBSA, and for tracts that are not rural areas, we use the median income for the county. So.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
CBSA for folks that don't know that acronym.
On the spot. Well, it's a census defined geography representing an area, but it may differ from an MPO area, but it's census defined.
Okay.
Thanks, y'all.
Well, thank you, Paul. Paul did not expect to be speaking on the webinar today, so thank you for stepping in because I did not know the answer. So now I'm going to turn this back to Gabe Watson for some further points on improvements.
Thanks, Bob. And really shout out to CNT for the work in developing that tool. I think it sets me up well from my point, but I think is also a tool that really opens up a lot of the capacity of the data behind CEJST. So I would really implore y'all to go check that out. And if it takes a little time to load, maybe wait a little bit after the webinar. So what I want to talk about now is including filters by category. And this is a really important part that would allow folks, both those who are responsible for funding allocation and benefits from Justice 40, as well as advocates looking to organize around particular issues, being able to see the data by category is really important. So right now, the interface only shows a specific community's burden categories rather than a community's burden, communities by a burden category. Viewing the data through filters by category reveals regional and state trends and some interesting things in the data. So if you want to go next slide here, Jesse. So this is a graph of looking at what is the largest contributing category to a state's portfolio of burden categories. So we see that climate, health, housing, and workforce development are really the four most popular categories. And just to mention, on the y-axis, we have the number of thresholds, right? So there's 34 thresholds, 8 categories. So we're seeing the average number of threshold exceedance within the category on the y-axis. So when we look at the data and we break it out by category, which is not something that you can currently do in CEJST, we see that in 80% of states, or 46 out of 55 states and territories, workforce development is the single most common category. And this is, although we really like workforce development, it's a really strong category, and it includes thresholds like linguistic isolation, unemployment, and other variables. And also it captures the most people of color compared to any other category. We want to stress the point that not being able to view the data in a category way, right, breaking it out, in the 1 through 8 of the different categories, kind of hides certain issues if you're looking for that particular burden. So if you want to, next slide here. So then when we break out workforce development, we still see climate, energy, and health, but also housing then becomes a really popular burden. I shouldn't say popular, but a burden that's affecting a lot of folks. And unfortunately, this graph isn't organized states by region, but you can kind of pick and choose here. So when we look at like Mountain West states like Wyoming, Colorado, Utah are experiencing a lot of issues with climate change. We'd expect that flooding, wildfires, those types of climate hazards really affect the Western states. And then we also see like energy is really a problem for Puerto Rico, Vermont, and housing shows up for New York and Rhode Island. And so there's a lot of other kind of nuances to the data that sort of get buried when we're not able to break things out by category. So really just put yourself in the shoes of, you know, a federal program officer who's in charge of doling out, say, $1 million, right, focused on, you know, climate resilience as it relates to like flooding, right? If you look at CEJST, you're only able to see just disadvantaged communities. Well, you know, if you're installing, you know, climate resilience adaptations like, you know, riparian buffers and whatnot, you really want to focus on the communities that are actually experiencing that problem rather than just disadvantaged as a whole. So our recommendation is to enable category filtering to show regional trends of impact to more easily inform program funding prioritization and benefit allocation. If you want to, next slide there, Jesse. And so our last point is really to bolster the community engagement and agency guidance surrounding CEJST. And just if you can bear with me on this analogy, it's helpful to think of CEJST kind of like a pipeline, right? On one end of the pipeline, you have disadvantaged communities, folks who are experiencing environmental burdens. And on the other end of the pipeline, you've got folks who are responsible for addressing those problems, the program officers, the folks who are implementing legislation. And it's really important that we make sure that both pipelines, or sorry, both ends of the pipelines allow for communities to get their voice and perspectives into the data, right? But then also guidance on the other side so that folks responsible for the benefit allocation can really have support in being able to decipher the data in analysis. So we'll talk about a few recommendations for community engagement and then agency guidance. So in terms of prioritizing community engagement, just want to like applaud CEQ up front. Right now, they've got an open source call that's in a complimentary Google group. They meet once a month. We talk about CEJST, Justice 40, and things like we're talking about on this presentation right now. But I think it would be really nice to see sort of a proactive outreach. Things like the Google group kind of tend to bias folks who have the awareness that it's happening, are able to attend in the first place. They're often busy organizing, right? And so having some proactive outreach, I think, would be really important, and also a note to compensate these folks. And there's definitely precedents to do so. And I think, although it's really good that CEJST is a national tool, right, and includes us, you know, Alaska and Puerto Rico and other territories that are often left out of tools, we also want to acknowledge that a lot of environmental justice issues are really at the local level, right? And so there's a sacrifice that you make when you are trying to say something about the entire country, but the problems are really local. So having a venue for adding additional data sets that are locally specific, so maybe not, you know, coverage for the entire country, would really kind of bolster that local nuance. And I think also a last point is really in kind of taking a page out of the tech industry, like data collection is really powerful. And, you know, being able to collect data on who's actually using CEJST, and more importantly, who should be using CEJST, aware of the tool and whatnot, but isn't, right? And prioritizing outreach so that advocates kind of have their voice and perspectives incorporated into the data. If you want to, next slide here. And again, just want to say that like USDS and CEQ, it's a big task and they are making progress on this front. So right now, if you want to talk about a self-designation, right, which is a really important part of kind of amplifying that voice for someone to be able to just say, hey, my community is not included in the tool, but I would like it to be, kind of streamlining that process. So here's an example of a EJ tool to prioritize solar investment in Illinois. And right on the front of the page, they have apply to designate your community. So I think that's like a really important component, making it really easy for folks to see that, so that they can fill out the form and get their community acknowledged in the data. So really local validation by environmental justice experts who live in the nation's most burdened communities really should be CEQ's North Star. Make the self-designation really, really simple and easy. Next slide here. Yeah, perfect. So then on the other side of that pipeline, we have the folks responsible for allocating benefits. And that task is not easy, especially when you're considering that there are over 30 different environmental justice tools at the local, state, and federal level. We see new tools coming out every month, and we really applaud this effort. But it can also be a bit confusing, and not just are there multiple federal tools. So there's EPA's EJ screen, and we're talking about the White House's CEJST tool, but then other agencies like Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, FEMA, they all have their own tool, right? And so if you're nested within, the bureaucratic structures, trying to figure out exactly what tool you should be utilizing, how you should be incorporating different data, is a challenge. If you want a next slide here. Yeah, so really, yeah, CEQ can continue. Oh, yeah, you're good right there. So CEQ can continue improving community involvement, and also refining the tool set and clearer guidance on various screening tools. And they have put out a couple documents on this. So in February, they released a memorandum basically telling federal agencies and program managers to utilize CEJST. And then they released an 8-page document with instructions on how to use CEJST. But back to my original point on, we often scrutinize the policies, but not necessarily these tools, which are very crucial in defining what is disadvantaged. I would posit that 12 collective pages is probably not enough guidance to be able to, shape how 40% of federal funding from the Infrastructure Jobs and Investment Act and bipartisan infrastructure law are being spent. So bolstering that would be a really big win. And that's it for me.
Wonderful. Well, thanks to all the presenters. And so now we are going to open it up to Q&A. I'm going to just pin some of the folks here so you can see them easily on your screen. We do have several questions already in the chat, but feel free to either raise your hand or put your question in the chat and would be happy to address them. I'm going to quickly just share this screen, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see each other a little bit more easily. But if you do have any follow-up questions or ideas that come to you after, feel free to reach out to any of us on this webinar, and we can go ahead and put that in the chat as well. And so I'm going to give a couple minutes there, but one of the first questions, or a question that came up, was, it says, in the bar charts, the average threshold exceedance, it visually seems that the average across the states is 1 threshold. I think I'm going to pass that question to you, Gabe. And would it be helpful, actually, before I stop sharing my screen, to go back to that bar chart? And I think this is the one that they're referring to.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And just to maybe, to answer, I can kind of clarify a little bit. This is looking at the most common category, right, in each state. And then on the y-axis is the average number of thresholds that are exceeding for each category. So each category has got 3 to 4 roughly thresholds within it. So we're not looking at, it's often a situation where you could have a relatively even spread of categories across a state, but what's the most common one? So I think that might be indicating kind of why we're seeing like low numbers, because we're only looking at a subset of the 34 thresholds. The max, I think, would be 4 possible thresholds to exceed.
I have another question here, and now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I can easily pull that back up in case folks have questions that they want to ask. But from Deborah, it says, throughout the presentation, you have mentioned 40% of funding. However, the bill mentions 40% of benefits. Could you please clarify? I'm happy to take that, and then feel free to chime in, any of the other panelists. But you're exactly right. So the executive order says 40% of benefits should flow towards disadvantaged communities. How benefits are defined is still being discussed. And it is not correct to assume that benefits just mean investments. It can mean many other types of things, as we understand that if we invest in one particular community, given the way the air moves or the water moves downstream, there could be benefits to those upstream or downstream communities, or east and west, depending on the type of ecosystem you're referring to. So great point. And that is correct, that it is benefits and not the investments. And I see questions that we put the contact information in the chat. We have another question saying, can you explain what you know about how CEJST will impact federal funding allocations? Are federal agencies mandated to use CEJST in determining eligibility scoring for grants? I'm happy to take this one as well, and then please others chime in if you have answers. So the guidance that Gabe was referring to, and maybe Gabe, you could put that in the chat if you have it handy, ask that agencies expeditiously start using CEJST in their funding allocations. That does not mean that they're mandated to, nor does it mean that all programs are represented within CEJST. And as we said before, there are other federal and state screening tools. And to make it more complicated, specific programs might already have things outlined, like we know on the drinking water side. The largest source of federal funding for that, the state revolving funds, has its own definition on a state-by-state level of what disadvantaged communities mean. As far as we understand it, the federal definition does not usurp the state level definitions for each of those programs, but still, I think, yet to be seen exactly how that plays out. And that's part of the aspects of, we just need a little bit more guidance in terms of what this means, how it's going to be used, how that then docks with all the different programs and the tools that exist. I see Bob nodding your head, but Bob or Manny or Dave, anything else you want to add on that front?
Yeah,
I'll just add, I don't think I have the answer, but I think that's one of the most important questions to be asking here. And we have been asking that question among ourselves as well as we've gone through this, about how will this influence what the agencies are doing. But I don't think we know. I think the guidance that Gabe had put in there is what we know at this point. But go ahead, Manny.
yeah, and so I think that it is a really important point to clarify, and I don't think any of us really have a firm idea of how that's going to play out for every agency. And I think that there will probably be some different implementations depending on which agency you speak to. For instance, DOT has a tool that they've currently have an RFI out for, that they have a new methodology for. We've reached out to them to try to get a read on whether or not that's going to supersede CEJST or if it's going to work in conjunction with it. And we didn't really get a clear response back. We got a response saying that they would use both, but it wasn't clear which priority would be used. So I think the manner of implementation is probably still up in the air for a lot of agencies, and we're hoping to get some more clarity with that in the coming months.
There's another question here as to how CEJST will impact federal permit decisions. And it's not lost on us that the Willow project was approved yesterday, even though that area was considered a Spanish community. I think right now that's still, I would say for me, an open question in terms of how those two different things play out. Right now, the way that the executive order is written is that this is only relating to the federal benefits and not the impacts. But there's also a companion piece to the climate and economic justice screening tool that we're talking about today called the Environmental Justice Scorecard, which does intend to rank federal agencies based on their environmental justice score, as the name implies. We've not yet seen a version of that. I haven't seen any further guidance as to how the EJ scorecard will be used beyond just the 1 or 2 paragraphs related to that, but there is an RFI open. But as far as we understand, permit decisions will be made independent of this. But again, that is not sure, at least to date.
And I can maybe chime in here. Maryland has a bill in legislation that would require Maryland Department of the Environment to utilize Maryland's CEJST version or MDEJ screen when doing permit approval process. So there's definitely more instances we're seeing of the tools being required in that permitting conversation, but I can't speak to the federal level in particular.
Yeah, that's a great point. I see a really good comment from Hillary in the chat. I don't think there's a question yet, but appreciate some of the recommendations that you're making in terms of how CEJST should be improved. And then I see a question from Elizabeth that says, the historic underinvestment indicator for CEJST relies on the boundaries drawn in redlining maps. Does anyone have recommendations or thoughts on how to measure historic disinvestment in areas that were not large enough to be redlined? I believe the population threshold was 200,000 at the time. A lot of work is being done to document exclusionary deeds, but the data lift there is quite high. Manny, Bob, Gabe, any responses
let me
to
just
that?
add a thought here, actually, that the second round of CEJST added that historic underinvestment indicator. It was not actually present in the beta, but then it did show up in version 1. And we looked at how many tracks were added because that indicator was put in, and the answer was very, very few. Because any place that had those kind of historic underinvestment problems was already showing up for other environmental justice problems. So it actually, having that was a good idea, but it didn't really qualify any new places in terms of places that previously had not been able to hit an indicator and now did. So I don't think that's a direct answer to you, but I think certainly it shows that there's very high levels of correlation between places that were historically underinvested and places that suffer all kinds of other environmental burden. And so you could probably approximate that with looking at places that currently are facing high degrees of climate or environmental or economic injustice because they are so overlapped with each other. So in other words, there's such a high correlation that you may not need to know that to be able to come up with a map that is pretty close.
Yeah.
So that's my thought. Would love to hear from others if they have thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I mean, our research pretty much echoed what Bob said, that it really didn't have much of an impact. But unfortunately, as far as I'm not an expert on redlining, and I'm not really aware of what can be done to, measure historic underinvestment in areas that didn't meet the qualifications to be included in the redlining maps.
Sorry, I did accidentally skip over a question from Hillary in her comment. And so Hillary is a representative of an environmental nonprofit that does restoration projects, and they use data and analytics to prioritize restoration on the place where they expect to have the most environmental benefit for the least cost. And they would like CEJST to incorporate their analytics to quantitatively or qualitatively show if and how the projects can generate environmental justice benefits. For example, implementing irrigation improvement projects on agricultural land in the West can improve water quality by reducing excess agricultural runoff and reduce water use. Their analytics show that overlap of projects with low income, flood risk, and other burdens, but our implementation projects do not directly address those issues. How important is it for our projects to show a direct link to a category of burden? It's a good question. And I don't know. I have a couple of thoughts, but I'll wait to see if Gabe or Manny or Bob want to tackle that first.
Yeah, I definitely have thoughts on this. Working for an EJ organization, the lens that we view a lot of our work through is that we try to, argue for a prioritization of efforts going in to fix issues that have been, put upon us because of decades of policy and, decades of underinvestment and decades of locating polluting facilities in proximity to communities of color. And so we always advocate that, that if because we have a limitation on reach for projects and reach for, limitation on funds, we have to prioritize areas that have been affected by these policies. So if I feel that the thrust of the question here is asking how important is it for your organization to think about the cumulative impacts and how you prioritize your projects, I would say it's pretty important. I think that the one way that we can address the historic marginalization of communities of color is to put them at the forefront of correcting those issues today. So yeah, I would really encourage you, especially, you know, if your organization has EJ concerns, to definitely take into consideration a holistic look at all the burdens communities or project areas are facing when you decide where to implement those projects.
Yeah, and I think just building off the point around, you know, if the restoration project doesn't directly link to flood risk, but you know that the benefit will have a reduction in excess water downstream, I would say that that link is pretty there if folks work in ecosystems. So I would say if you want to accentuate it and how you describe the projects, I don't think that's too far of a stretch. I see another question in the chat asking if we could say a little bit more about disaggregating tool data to consider local priorities. Would it be possible to integrate groups of indicators into other tools to reflect those priorities, or would you generally recommend considering indicator groups as a factor in overall disadvantage? And a related point to that is the proliferation of local tools. How do you choose which tool to use and when? Maybe I'll pass this one to Gabe because I know we've been thinking a lot about the term interoperability of these different tools. Are there standard baselines that we might be able to agree upon? And then what does that mean to zoom into local priorities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think as it relates to data disaggregation, really the exercise first should be to understand what is the issue that you're trying to solve, right? And if you're curious about air pollution versus wastewater discharge or wildfires, drought, et cetera, that's going to have different solutions. And also consequently, you're going to be focusing on different communities. I will say that there's a lot of overlap between the White House's CEJST tool and the EPA's EJ screen. I'm posting that in the chat now. And that does have the ability to basically filter by different burdens. So kind of once you've decided what are the variables, right? What are the burdens that you're most curious about? You're able to kind of prioritize looking at the data in this way. If you actually look at the methodology, a lot of the data sets are very similar. So yeah, it's a good kind of, you know, it complements CEJST in terms of CEJST is a bit more UI friendly, I would say. And then your second, or the follow-up question, I'm going to post another resource that we put here, and it's still under development, and we are adding new tools to the list. But I would definitely say first and foremost is to go to the local geography or the smallest geography that you have a tool available for. So if you are fortunate enough to you know, be in a state that has an EJ tool, I would definitely kind of look there first, because you're going to see a lot of data layers that aren't available nationally. And also those tools tend to have a bit more community involvement, just being that they are at a smaller geographic scale. And some municipalities, so like New York, Seattle, also have tools at the municipal level. And in terms of the interoperability, that is a great question. And
I threw that in there. I don't know if they called it interoperability.
Yeah, and just to kind of you know, de-techify the terminology, right? That we've got like all of these different tools, 30 plus of them. But if we want to say, take a data layer from one tool and compare it to data layers in another tool, you have to have some sort of technical sophistication to be able to do that. if you look at like the tech industry at large, or in really like the open source culture, so things like GitHub, things like open source documentation and whatnot, are definitely a step in the right direction. So CEJST is on GitHub and like is open source. So if you wanted to run the tool on your machine, if you wanted to pull the data and join it with another tool or another data set, you can totally do that. But in terms of how do we get all of the tools, Bob mentioned the term cottage industry of EJ tools, to kind of all sort of talk together, be able to be on the same page, or same screen, I should say, is kind of a difficult nut to crack, and is something that we're thinking a lot about at Epic on the technology team.
Bob or Manny, anything else you want to add to that? I see there's a couple more questions in the chat that I might get to, but wanted to give you the chance to respond if there's anything you wanted to.
No, I think we can move on. And there was one
Okay.
directly to me that I wanted to speak to, if that's okay, from Caroline, I think.
Sure, go ahead.
You want to speak to that one? Yeah. So we can make the tool as complicated as we want to. We actually had a slightly more complicated version of it that we have not released publicly because we thought it was too complicated. But it let you do things like change income thresholds, count by like how many indicators would you need to hit to qualify, and things like that, which Paul probably has a link to that, and we could maybe send it around to anyone who's interested, or put it in the chat here if he's still on and can do that. But we ended up going with something that was a little just more kind of usable. But honestly, we would like to continue working on this topic. We think there's going to be a ton of work here, particularly as every agency comes out with its own version of interpreting this. And so I think we're always very open to ideas about what else could our tool do that would help people analyze it. So what you have there, Caroline, is good. And if you could put your email or something in the chat, we can send you a link to a more complicated one too. Which, as I'm saying that, I realize everyone else is going to want to see that too. So we can just make that part of the slides at the end to link to that, so anyone who gets the slides could see it. So
yeah, happy to.
Yeah. Cool.
I'm going to go back up to a question from Stefan that says, one of the biggest challenges we face is a finite limit on our resources and financial capacity to address these historic issues. There's no question that we should attempt to correct the legacy problems, but should we factor in the actual benefit achieved from each new dollar invested within the disadvantaged community? That's a meaty question. I'm going to let that simmer and see if Gabe, Bob, or Manny, if y'all want to take a stab at that one. That was a lot of meat, like stabbing. I don't know why I use that term, but anyone want to take that question?
Yeah, I can maybe, oh, Manny.
Go for it, Gabe.
Okay, cool. Like we kind of mentioned in the webinar, these cumulative burdens, I think, is a really important component in prioritizing communities that have multiple problems, and also communities that are kind of suffering from the historic underinvestment. I think while it's useful to think about efficiency, and there's only so much time and there's only so much money, I think kind of the North Star should be who is the most affected and who has been the most affected for the longest, right? And so I think that's why we're advocating for a lot of the changes in CEJST, is the UI, the user interface, would kind of allow those communities to sort of float to the top, so to speak, or color in a certain way so that they really are highlighted. It is a difficult challenge, though, when you only have a certain amount of resources. So I think really focusing on the cumulative burden component, and really kind of having an open mind for what the different data sets are, to be able to contextualize and prioritize your problem. Man, if you had any follow-up to that.
Yeah, and so I think it's an interesting way to think about things, and I think that accountability and making sure that the projects that the federal government puts forward actually have an impact is very important. And when I start to think about how that fits in with cumulative impacts and the hurdles that communities of color are facing, I take a look at those maps that we showed earlier, and how, you know, the communities of color are facing this incredible amount of burden, right? Meeting every single category identified within the CEJST tool means that you are facing high levels of pollution, high levels of social and economic burden. And so that there are so many ways in which the federal government can come in and make your life better. In essence, these communities are the low-hanging fruit on how we can improve our society, right? They are the areas where you can have the biggest bang for your buck because they have been historically underserved, and that is evident when you look at these socioeconomic and climate and environmental indicators. So I think that when you look at the high levels of burden and you try to think about where can we spend money to have the best impact on life expectancy, best impact on people's academic and educational outcomes, best impact on improving quality of life, I always come back to those communities. And I think that that's the place where we really can have a huge impact by having an appropriate targeted response there.
Awesome. Well, we have made it to the end of the hour. I really appreciate everyone's questions. Again, our emails are in the chat. We'll also follow up with everyone with the recording, with the slides, with many of the resources that we dropped in the chat today, and just really appreciate everyone joining and for the participation, and especially to Gabe, Manny, and Bob for the hard work that y'all put in, and the teams of folks behind y'all that also supported a lot of the analysis that went into this today.
And shout out to Jesse for facilitating. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. It's great to work with you.